yeah.
Welcome back to another episode of Out of the Blank. Steven, the man, the myth, the legend, the cult superior exposer. Is that what would you call yourself, more of a cult exposer or a cult soother, or someone that talks to people who's gone through tragic experiences?
The cult whisperer. I like that.
Yes.
No, I'm just learning. I'm a cult. I'm a survivor, I suppose, of a cult, but I'm also somebody that wants to understand what's going on, how it works, and ultimately, with a view to protecting people against them.
We've kind of, at least through the past two times you've been on, it's your third time now. We've had more of deep dive experiences into the mind and the manipulational tactics of these high control groups, which you prefer to really kind of call them in a way too, because that's kind of what it is. It's a high control group. But which one are you the most afraid of, and which one do you find the most fascinating? Because Scientology's catching up on my heels of keeping me a little bit of afraid in a way, mostly because they're sending me messages and they've been stalking my profile ever since I first kind of tagged them as a joke. Because you tag someone with a blue check mark, you don't actually expect them to see it. And in my case, I was talking shit. I never thought I would. I never thought they'd actually see it, and they did. And yeah.
Oh, you're on their radar now. Then I don't know. I think. So you asked me two questions: which is the most dangerous?
Yes.
And which am I most interested in? It depends how you want to look at it. So if you're thinking about which groups affect the most people, so you could say that's the most dangerous because they affect millions of people. So there you're talking about big groups like the one I was in, Jehovah's Witnesses, and depending on how you define and whether you want to upset people, Mormons or some evangelical groups and so on could also kind of fit into that category. So we're talking millions of people here. Jehovah's Witnesses have around 8 million people that
there's a base in my town I didn't even know about. I saw a little lodge that said Freemasonries, or not Freemasonry, Jehovah's Witnesses. I keep getting this
Kingdom
two mixed
Hall.
up. Yeah. But I saw that and I was so pent up with anger that I wanted to walk in there with a bat and just beat them, but I wouldn't do that because I'm not a harmful person. But I would smother them with nothing but chloroform.
Well, the thing is, unfortunately, they're the victims, so you don't want to do that. Yeah. So the vast majority of people in these groups, although they are the people that you see and that you meet and that are the face of the group, they're also the victims of the group. So it's easy to get angry with them when they knock on your door and ask you silly questions and try and get you to get a watchtower or start a Bible study or something, and what they're talking about seems absolutely crazy. But I was that person, so I know what it's like to be that person knocking on the door, feeling nervous, feeling hesitant about the whole thing. I mean, you think about it, Rob, it's a really weird thing to do, isn't it? Knock on somebody's door and say, what's your view about God? I mean, what a bizarre thing to do.
Unless they're selling cookies, they're not invited.
Well, you don't wait to be invited. That's the thing. You just knock on the door. So yeah, it's easy to get angry, but I mean, my view is that they are the victims. So actually, they're the ones that need help. So I think in terms of the impact, it's groups like that are the most dangerous, if you like. But then I don't think they're as extreme as some. So on our podcast, we've recently interviewed, it's actually not come out yet, but it'll be coming out in a couple of weeks' time. We've interviewed a woman from the Children of God cult, now named the Family International, apparently. And, some of the horrific things that she's been through and that others like her have been through in that group. We're talking about kind of systematic abuse of women and children.
I don't want to piggyback or guest hijack, but do you mind sending me one of them Mormons or sending me somebody else that's not in Scientology? I like talking to Scientology. I've had great experiences, but when we talk about most dangerous, I would say most dangerous to yourself. I would say, at least when it comes into diving into that realm, because I didn't notice the doors getting blown off when I really started talking about Scientology. I'm not afraid. I honestly don't give a shit. I'm more afraid of the CCP because they could kidnap the shit out of me. But but I'm out of that rabbit hole, so we don't need to talk about them. But when we look at Scientology, for instance, it's more about like that's a cult that can actually probably pick up a lot of steam today, mostly because there's a lot of people that aren't necessarily feeling value, and an easy way to get value and being at least feeling, would be in the presence, be in the room with a superstar like Tom Cruise. Scientology would give you that promise. Me and you right now could join Scientology. You're not saying we would, but we could join it, and we would have a possibility to meet one of these higher ups or be in a group with these higher up people.
I guess they might put that as a bit of a carrot to get you to join. But I think the way that Scientologists do
that's
it
a Mission
is,
Impossible sized carrot.
is I think they normally kind of attract people in the self-development area. So they get you to do this is how they've done it traditionally, is they invite often young people to do a personality test. And this personality test gives them some information. It may be accurate or not, but they then home in on, would you like to be more successful? Would you like to? We all struggle at times with, I guess, feelings of doubt and mental health issues and so on. So a lot of these groups do play on that and give the sort of sell the opportunity to better yourself and become a better version of you. And that's why Tom Cruise is so important to them, because I mean, he looks like wow, you could be like Tom Cruise, how wonderful would that be? But the reality is that, actually that's not the experience for most people that join. There might be a little bit of sort of pseudo pop psychology that helps in the first place, and that's the hook that they then drag you into some of the wild beliefs that they have. If you've talked to Scientologists, you'll know all that. I'm not an expert in that, but it's it's really out there stuff, and it's not helpful.
Well, saying psychology doesn't exist, or psychology is a type of pseudo magic, and then you're using the exact realms of psychology to be able to trick people and manipulational tactics. I think that's why I got so interested in Scientology. It's probably the one I don't really fear the most. I mean, if one day I come up missing on the back of a milk carton, you'll probably know it's one of the three. It's the Clintons, it's the CCP, or it's Scientology. But when you look at Scientology, the aspect of that, if people do end up leaving and defecting, you can't talk to them, because those are the people that are now in the trials of redemption, which means if they do end up coming back, it's because they left because they did wrong, not the church was wrong. But my buddy mentioned this to me, and I've been thinking about this to myself. So it actually might be a common sense type thing. I mean, a lot of ideas I have, they might ring true, or they might come off as Alex Jones type things. But I was talking about how Scientology, I think their methods are governmental things. Their statuses that the government uses, which is by, process of how they get their members, maybe a type of swaying of this is how cool it is and this is how it is, but you really can't kind of step out of line. It's more of like a strict style, whatever you would call an Illuminati, sure. But when he said it to me, I was like, so you can kind of see the methods of it too, the brainwashing aspects, the kind of the hyping up the patriotism, which at times I'm a patriot at heart, but you can get fallen in line with so much of what you believe in that you can't necessarily pull down fact from the reality that you've created in your head. And that's where it starts to get super dangerous, because physical abuse you can heal from, sure, depending on the severity, obviously, but mental abuse is the most hardest thing to cure. And saying psychology or depression, for instance, if you are depressed, then you might as well just end yourself and find a new body that thetan can go into. And I'm like, that's where I start to have a line get drawn, because I don't think you understand that you're acting like a puppet master and you're preying on people's most precious aspects. And this is why I want to also learn about the Mormon Cults. So if you know anybody involved with that, I would like to speak with, because that's a religion that's, I mean, if you look at religion in a grand aspect, I don't mean to shame on religion. I think it's needed. I really do. But God damn it, Stephen. Cross yourself. I can't say those words. But if you look at the stories they tell, it's like, because everybody else questioning this, like, why did a guy pray to God because some kids were making fun of him about being bald, and then God sent down 2 bears to kill these kids? Like,
40 odd children for being called a bald head. I mean, so this is an area that all everybody that's in this space sort of has to grapple with, how do you talk about this? Because on the one hand, I'm happy to show my colours. I'm an atheist. I'm a humanist. I don't have any religious belief nowadays, but I don't put all religions in the same category as cults, for this one reason, which I think is important to be able to differentiate, is that cults, and we talked about this before, but cults are about getting you into the group in order to do their bidding, and in order to do that, they need as much control as possible. So that's why I use this term, high control group. So if you're a Catholic, I mean, this may have been different thousands of years ago, but if you're a Catholic, you can go to church kind of when you feel like it, and you can become more or less involved in the church. Sure, the priest might tell you off for doing things, but or you might struggle at some confession, but basically, you can come and go. And if you decide to leave the church and become something else, then maybe your friends will be sad. Maybe you're told you're going to go to hell, but actually nothing else happens to you. Whereas in cults, you have, like in Scientology, you have this disconnection. In Jehovah's Witnesses, you have this fellowshipping. So these are what they set up is a system where they create a situation where you only have other group members to rely on, and they're your whole world, they're your only community, because you are encouraged to get rid of connections from outside. So that they've set up this situation now where you're totally dependent upon this group for everything, what you believe, or your friends, probably your marriage partner, or your whatever situation you've got there. It's all about the group. And then the threat is, if you leave or if you do something wrong, we're going to take all that away from you. And so it's a very simple tactic, actually. There's a lot of kind of nonsense talked about cults. I mean, some of they do some funny things, but basically it's a very simple concept. Set up a situation where you are completely dependent upon them, and then threaten to take that away. And that's what they do. So that's how they keep control over their members. So that's the danger of cults. And then all the other things that are done within that setup are designed to make you more and more dependent upon the group, and to get you deeper and deeper into it. And so in the end, you don't know how to get out. It's just you're completely trapped.
Well, tribe addiction, basically. It's the same method as like the phone or internet was a delicacy, and now it's kind of a requirement in a lot of ways, because now you've kind of set up your life around this thing that's basically been an uninvited type incidents into your head now, where it's kind of more of an Now you've listened and we've talked to me, or kind of, you got to get my personality. I like to throw in a weird perspective of things too.
I know.
So I was talking to a buddy of mine who studies Spartan history, and then I had a buddy of mine with Greece history, and it's an upcoming episode, or by the time this comes out, it'll probably be after. We had a talk down about Greek and Roman and trying to understand the basics of it. And I started to notice so many things about it, where it was like the Romans had a grand aspect of the underworld, or this death that's better than the life you have now. So I was like, this is kind of like Norse mythology. If you fight for us, if you go to war for us, when you die, you'll get a giant feast in front of you, like Valhalla. And I'm like, it's kind of like that as well too, where I started questioning, and here's the kind of skeptical part. We got to watch our little tippy toe across the glass or whatever. Maybe the idea to stop people from being depressed and hurting themselves and stop being a productive member of society is tell them, if you kill yourself, you're going to hell. And the way hell's been depicted has been this place that everything, because I have friends of mine that are good people, and they have hurt themselves, and they've ended their own lives. And I look at that like maybe they change their perspective, because I feel like a reason why maybe a lot of people might do it, or might sacrifice themselves, or do something where they're trying to save somebody's life, or have someone else, like a cop suicide, hurt themselves, is because they have that fear aspect of going to hell. Necessarily they might not be religious, but they might not know about what's on the other side if there is another side, and they don't want to take that chance. So I look at it like there's no way a good person, even if they do get to that point of depression to hurt themselves, end up in hell. So I look at this aspect of like, when do we start poking holes into these things, not necessarily on the belief aspect, but on the fear aspect? Because there's a lot of riddled fear that goes with religion, which is why I have a giant issue with it. But at the same time, I understand its importance. But I think this is what lures people, friends of mine who've been involved into these cults, to this fear aspect of now they've kind of woken up to it, but they're seeing all of it happen where they get really, really aggressive. And sadly, when it comes to optics, your aggression being thrown out of nowhere in a lot of these cases doesn't play a good side in your favor. My friend Stephanie, who writes a blog about Scientology, she was on Mike Rinder's podcast about Scientology with Leah Remini, and she was telling me about the court case of Mike Rinder and everything that happened with him. Well, I had a random message pop in my DMs from an unknown account that ended up, I guess, deleting their profile, but the message was still there, that led me into Mike Rinder's daughter. And then that perspective of it. And it's like, well, if you don't truly know the court case, or you don't truly know the situation, you come across her story, her perspective, it's hard for you to like Mike Rinder. It's hard for you to like those types of people. And I start to realize it's all about the first impressions, but also the amount of fear or lying to that starts to happen, where a perspective over 10 years has been distorted and thrown through a washing machine of just bullshit. And I'm like, what in my life is that? What the delivery service, FedEx, UPS, they're just like, we're going to take our time delivering your packages. And I'm like, it fucking never got here on time anyway. Like, we're brainwashed and we're relying on a system that is run by people to deliver our basic and essentials or essential things when it comes to delivering packages. Same thing with food. We expect food to be in the grocery store. How long until that's eventually going to be taken away and moved to online shopping? I get down these rabbit holes and I need help.
I'm going to interrupt you there. I think we've kind of spoken about this before. I think what you've, well, my opinion, Rob, for what it's worth, is that you're going to spot a lot of similar practices and tactics, if you like, in any organization. So my master's is in organizational psychology. So I actually study businesses and organizations, mainly, commercial organizations, about how they operate psychologically. So how do managers manage? How do leaders lead organizations? What's a charismatic leader, for instance? And all of those sorts of questions. And there are lots of overlap between how normal organizations like FedEx or whatever operate and the way that a high control group might operate. That doesn't mean they're a high control group. If you've got a group of people, then you have certain structures that you need to create. Like, you normally have some sort of hierarchy. You normally have some sort of way of managing your people, if you like. That normally has a shape a bit like like a hierarchy, like an organization chart. That's what businesses do. That's what religious organizations do. And in effect, that's what cults do. You have an inner sanctum, if you like, with a few people who have the power. Maybe one has the ultimate power. Often they're a charismatic person. And then through this decision-making cabal, they then send out the instructions to their minor managers, and they manage the sort of end result of that, which could be individual teams, or if it's a retail store, could be individual shops. If it's a cult, it could be individual communes or congregations or whatever. So you're going to see similar structures, and you're also going to see some similar psychological effects. But I think what you have to remember with cults is that it's about taking it to 11. It's about taking normal things like trying to convince somebody or trying to influence somebody, which we all do all of the time. But it's taking that and doing it, turning it up to 11 stupid. It's about turning it up the dial, so you're doing it to the nth degree, or to a much greater degree than you would normally see in a normal situation. So that's what you're spotting things that, yes, of course, you see. Most businesses try to create think about how Facebook created a kind of dependence on this service that we hadn't heard about sort of 20 years ago, but now, yeah, it's like if they switched it, well, it went off for like a few hours and everybody Whoa, what am I going to do? So that's what happens. But there's lots of things like that. The internet itself. Yes, you're absolutely right. You can't really do without it, because that's how you manage your bank account nowadays, and it's how you pay bills and so on. So yeah, so they create a dependency on the thing, but I don't think that's the same thing as setting up a high control group.
Well, here's where I'm going to add to that. So when we talk about Facebook being down, now I went to school for addiction, so I can tell you about addiction counseling and how people get addicted to things. I can understand that very easily. But when it comes to a concept of when Facebook went down, people looked at how addicted to your devices are. I put up a funny tweet, but everyone went to Twitter to check the status of Facebook and Instagram. Yeah. Here's where it gets tricky, is the fact that Facebook can sell your data and do all these different things that sells your personal private information, where now you're considered the product. Facebook isn't really the product, or social media isn't the product anymore.
Absolutely.
The idea that the whistleblower, the giant whistleblower everybody's talking about that hates Mark Zuckerberg, if you look at her profile, she was verified and her account was created in October, and she was verified on the 5th of October. She gained over 80,000 something followers, and now she has I think close to 1 million something followers now. The algorithm has now been in her favor to now everyone can get sided to her. Her idea was that the Capitol Hill riots, all these giant protests and all these things, are incentivizing people because these algorithms give you basis on things that you like. So if you're looking up, let's say, for example, for me, I watched a horse kill a crocodile, which I never knew could happen, but it killed a crocodile, stomped right on its head, killed it. Then I watched another crocodile video and another crocodile video and another crocodile video. And eventually I watched a woman fall into a crocodile pit. Now the algorithm took me there. The algorithm gave me this thing, which means that it's kind of incentivizing a darker turn in a mental capacity diminishing. So she's pro the C-230 bill. She wants to pass this, which allows media to have more censorship. They're thinking that she's a government-sanctioned whistleblower because of how fast her account got verified, how quickly access and how widespread out of nowhere this fucking person came from that says she's worked for Zuckerberg for so long. But then Zuckerberg is also pro C-230 bill. And now when you read into this bill, it does censorship, sure. But then when do you draw the lines? If they're already working on tracking your browsing data, that means they can move the line farther to consider what a terrorist might be. Now, these are large extremes that eventually could end up happening. That means if you type in anything about how to get this through TSA packaging, even if it's fucking shampoo, that you want to get an extra couple of ounces of shampoo into your bag, that can be put you on a domestic terrorist watch list, because now you're going against the system of rules that are in play. So the difference between a cult and a business aspect, Bezos, shit way for conditions, but he's running a business. So bathroom breaks, cutting down the times, amount of bullshit, cutting you out after 3 years because he thinks you become lazy. Those are all business opportunities, which he's in full so to do so. But then if you look at Kellogg's, for instance, the Kellogg strike that's going on, all these workers complaining after their 5-year contract went up that their conditions are dog shit. They don't get vacation hours. They're getting paid so very little. Then here's where we see the cult part of this. The CEO goes on to a live news broadcast and starts saying they make over $120,000 a year salary. And then it's all these different conditions where it's like, then why would they be fighting and everyone's protesting if they weren't getting that? That doesn't make any sense. The math doesn't add up. If you have 50,000 employees and each one is making now they're lying on air. What stops that from being a cult? That is not a business anymore. That is a lying and deceitful one.
I think, that's what you're describing there is, also I know nothing about the case you're talking about, so I have to caveat whatever I say on that because I don't know. But what you're describing sounds like, I'd call it sharp business practices, or if you like, lying. So the world has always had lots of people that lie in it. So people do try to con others out of money and possessions by getting them sucked into sort of schemes, if you like. So there's that. Is that a cult? There's a whole industry around managing media messages, isn't there? And this is one of the reasons why you talk about Scientology and other groups. They have billions of dollars to be able to spend on managing their image, which is why they can be very aggressive at times because they can afford all the lawyers to stop people doing things or so on. So there is a crossover, but I think My own view is that we need to, if we want to study cults, then we need to understand what we're talking about and restrict it to that. Otherwise, yes, we can bring in theory from other places, but if we're not careful, everything becomes a cult. So everybody's political views. Oh, you're in a cult. This business. Well, that's just like a cult, and that business. Well, that's a cult, and all religions are cults. But in the end, what you're describing is culture, social mechanisms that human beings use to get what they want, more of what they want. So what we always do as human beings is we are political creatures in a way, and we try to maneuver. We try to get the best position that we can. If you've ever watched chimpanzees in like a big compound in the UK, we have a park called Monkey World, and they rescue chimps from zoos and stuff. And you can actually watch the way that they interact, and all of that stuff. There's the politics of it. There's I'm going to be friends with this one because he's more powerful, and then they've all got to be friends with the big, the alpha male, if you like. And actually, human beings are very similar in the way that we operate as social creatures. We're much more sophisticated, but basically we are about trying to ensure that we have access to resources, that we have, excuse me, that we have safety, that we have, as a male, if you like, access to sex and to a group that's going to protect us and so on. These are all very old instincts, but we still have them as human beings. So, you're always going to see, I'm trying to influence you, you're trying to influence me, you're trying to get one up on this person, they're trying to get the best foot up there that they can, and there's an opportunity for me to increase my power here or there. And so when you scale that up to multi-million-dollar businesses and organizations, essentially they're still playing that political game. Is that a cult? Well, you can call it what you like, but my area of interest is in high control groups where they attract people through lying to them, and then once they're in, they restrict their freedom to be able to make decisions for themselves.
Okay, so let's take that to the media then. CNN.
Yeah.
CNN has just recently been on a Joe Rogan podcast with the chief medical advisor, exposed about him taking a certain medicine. They called it horse dewormer, called him out on his lies, and he couldn't answer a lot of the questions when it came to the vaccine and anti-vax kind of debate in a way. There was common evidence that they were pulling up that they just weren't talking about on CNN. They abruptly lied. Now, that's brainwashing. That's limiting the information to the people. That's lying to them as well. Major lies on their network, and then swaying their decision and opinions, which overall mess up with their thoughts. Where you start looking at, like, I'm not pro any of these networks, but it's not business tactics, it's cult tactics. But then when we label as a cult, it's affecting your decision-making skills and hindering the progress, and also creating a fear narrative. Now, we can tackle the big one, sure, culture and cult for sure. We can look at the aspect of like the Catholic Church. Why is everyone so goddamn surprised about this? There was a stereotype about it for a couple hundred years now, but everyone's like, oh, this is real? No shit, it comes from somewhere. It's like the same thing with, oh God, I was going to say the Catholic Church. And then there was, I can't think of the second example, but you start boiling it down to, in my aspect of what is the worst possible thing that needs to be focused on, is when you're lying and you're manipulating people's thoughts. And this is what hinders freedom. And this is what hinders a giant open door for control. Now, this can obviously be seen more with religious aspects of things too, which is a sketchy line to be drawn. That's kind of be pushed back every single day. You're seeing more and more get done. But when we start looking at, like, there's a lot of ideas and theories. There's one about the Dark Ages never existed because back in whatever 700 69 AD or something like that. The guy who wanted to rule at that time period wanted to rule at the new millennia. So he thought that he got with the Pope, and they created this whole fake history about King Arthur and all this type of stuff to boost the clock up 300 years. That's brainwashing, or that is a type of terrible control or power of a cult extremist, 100% in my opinion. But then we look at the things that sway the opinions and thoughts that cause aggression and tension and riots that happen now. Why, when there was a school shooting in Texas, they didn't say that the color of the person's skin, when on every single type of thing they show the color of the person's skin, because they think that will be, oh, we can't do that only if it fits their narrative. Now that is brainwashing. I don't care what color skin you are. If it's a shooting, I want to know the details of that shooting. That's the thing, is where you start to see the manipulational tactics and what they choose to pick and choose to what they want to show you, which affects people's fucking minds and creates tension. That's a cult thing to me. It might not be to you,
Well,
but that's
I
terrible.
mean, I in a way, I'm not disagreeing that some of what you said is worrying and troubling, and yeah, we should address it. I'm just, I suppose, from a science perspective, you really try to define your terms first, and I mean, a term like brainwashing, for instance, is it in itself quite controversial. Some people say there's no such thing. Other people say there is absolutely a thing. So what do we mean when we talk about brainwashing? So one of our guests recently, Alexandra Stein, she's done a lot of work on this, and she identifies a mechanism by which cults set up this situation where the individual, it's called attachment theory, which has been around for a long time. It's a psychological theory. We understand it quite well about the way that we attach ourselves to other people, particularly in early childhood, to our primary caregiver, often our mother, but our primary caregiver. And you can actually form attachments later in life. So you think about this attachment setup where you trust this individual, you know that you can always go back to them for safety and security. But as a child, you might go off and explore, but you're always going to come back to this safe and secure base. And so this idea of an attachment is a system that human beings have, and that we kind of have developed over evolution. And we now we also develop this as we grow older as well. So we develop attachment figures in adult life. And what cults do, according to Dr. Stein, is they set up a system where you have this attachment figure that you become attached to. So you go to them for love and for comfort and for support, but they also are the person that you fear. So they are frightening. They're a frightening attachment figure. So you've got this situation where you want to go back to them because you are you love them, you need them, they're your sole source of attachment, but they're also the one that's frightening you. And it's also where abusive relationships work. It's also how, in marriages or relationships where maybe one party is abusing the other and controlling their behavior, it's the same sort of principle. So what I'm saying is these are very specific systems that are being used by these groups. A lot of what you're describing is bad. What you're talking about, though, is lying to people and having an agenda that means that perhaps organizations don't want to tell the whole truth. But that's always been the case. If you think about history, if you read history books, history written by the ancient Babylonians and whatever, written by the ancient Hebrews or the ancient, your friend obviously will know all of this, who talks about these ancient peoples. They always talk about their successes in battle. They never talk about their losses, or very rarely, or if they do talk about their losses, they'll explain it in terms of something like they upset a god, and so they had to then, appease this god, and then they won the mighty battle. So there's always been propaganda. There's always been manipulation of media, whatever that media was at the time. Can you imagine the kings and queens of England not having their own media or their own propagandists telling people, that the king is the most wonderful person. He's here by God's grace. He's actually, kings ruled because God had given them that position. That's how they ruled, and the people accepted that. Well, that's just lying, isn't it? Because God isn't interested in which king is going to be king of England. So it's, I think, politics, propaganda, lying, sharp business practices. We have a very connected world now, so it's easier to do a lot of that stuff. But I think it's a different thing to what I'm talking about.
My evidence that I've given right here in the statement that's happening now is not to be based off of what's happening now. It's to be based off where that's going to lead. Much like cults back in the day used to be people dressed up in cloaks, sacrificing things in front of a giant effigy of a wood style, or much like Bohemian Grove. I don't know if you know that little chestnut. I think I've told you about that.
Yes, I've heard about that. Yeah, the Mark Ronson, and
it's dumbing down to where the point where we would consider a cult now. Everyone either says cult, they think of cloaks, and now it's a different form. Much like the people who talk to the people who've experienced this type of things, like Jehovah's Witnesses, the people aren't really a cult. But if you understand the history of it and you understand what happens in it and the manipulational tactics, you can classify it as that. Now, business might not be in that aspect, but what's stopping it from leading there? Eventually, it's going to lead there. Like, nobody would have thought that the news would have lied. I saw a bunch of people messaging me like, dude, CNN's outright like lying. And it's like, yeah, you see it now because it was exposed on a bigger platform. It was seen in a different perspective. It wasn't a gang of people that all agreed on the same thing, agreeing over a topic and choosing what they wanted to play. And this is a first time in history where that's really been a known thing for a lot of people. We always stereotypical. That's the other stereotype. We always joke that news, it's all BS anyway. Then when you fucking see it, you're like, what? It's like, no shit. And
yeah, I mean, they've always lied though. I mean, you think during the well, I'm not old enough to remember it, but I understand during the Second World War there was, there was a ministry for propaganda, and that was not in just in Germany. Of course, they had that too, but they had it in the UK, and as far as I understand it,
it's here in Russia too. Russian troll farms. They're fake bot accounts online that'll stir up animosity with people. But I look at this like
Vietnam. There was like America was winning that war, but obviously it wasn't. So they've always lied to us.
People said they don't give a shit about the news, and then they watch the news, but journalism used to be if you printed a retraction, you lost your career. Now they will print a retraction and nobody will see the retraction because all they do is see the major headline. That's the issue, is not holding these things accountable as well, too. The only thing that we've seen be held accountable is when the White House banned, I think it was Fox or someone, from talking about the kids in cages because they flew a drone over there, and they banned them for 1 week about talking about any of these incidences. What I'm saying is it's not looking closely at the aspect of what's going on now, but looking about where that's going to head. It might be 5 years, it might be 10 years. I have no clue. But at one point, I don't think anybody thought that William Shatner would go to fucking space, and he did.
Captain Kirk went to space.
And now he's fucked up by it. He's mentally messed up. He was in 3 other interviews afterwards where he was crying. He's like, I don't know how to like live anymore because I've seen that already.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, what I was going to say, yes, is I actually share your concern about where things are going. And however we frame that, whether we say there's a risk for people essentially becoming parts of cults, I think there is. Yes, of course, there's always that danger. I mean, we do have cult states. If you look at North Korea, it is essentially a state that is a cult. So yes, it is possible to have states that are like that. I think that for me, the thing that worries me the most, the thing that keeps me awake at night more than anything else, as a dad, thinking about my daughter and possible grandchildren and so on, is
wait, hold on. Would you let her talk to me on my show? I feel like
for sure. No, I mean she's my co-host on our podcast, so
I'd love the chat.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'll set it up, see if she wants to do it. But I think that this separation, this tribal nature that and I think it is social media that has exacerbated this. That the fact that essentially we are. And I don't think there's anything. I don't think this is being done by some clever behind the scenes thing. But I think it's almost like an emergent thing that's happening, but we are being separated into tribes. If you think about what Twitter does, so I use Twitter quite a lot for promoting my podcast and so on. But if you think about what Twitter is doing, it is literally separating people into tribes, into groups. So, you keep seeing that tweet from that idiot that thinks this political view that you don't agree with. So you either stop following them, or maybe you even block them because you don't want to see it anymore. And then you see that other comment, oh, idiot, I'm going to stop following them. And so basically you're weeding out all the people that don't agree with you, and you're hoarding all the people that do agree with you. So you're creating your own little tribe. And actually the algorithm is doing this. So actually the algorithms underneath Twitter are separating everybody into little groups. I call it like the sorting hat on the Harry Potter films. You're being sorted into these little groups. And I think that's what you're seeing in the States. If you think about viewers of CNN and viewers of Fox News, they are playing to their audience, to who they think they should be talking to. And of course, they will have paymasters as well, people that give money to these things. But I think it's often around commercial decisions. So, CNN did fantastic business, as far as I can understand it, when Donald Trump was president. Because, of course, if you didn't like Donald Trump, you'd jump onto CNN and you'd hear all the stuff about Donald Trump. Same goes for Fox, though. Of course, they did great business as well, because if you did like Donald Trump, that's the place to go. So you've got these two factions that seem to be further and further apart. And that's what worries me. I think it's worse in the States, but I do see it happening over here in the UK too, and it does bother me.
Well,
that does bother me.
Who's the guy that looks like a Trump version in the UK?
Well, our prime minister is called Boris Johnson, who, he's got blonde hair, and he's he's a bit strange, which I suppose is why people think he looks a bit like Trump.
Well, a lot of people I saw videos of people throwing apples at him and shit while he was trying to walk into a building. But then I just watched from I think 3 years ago was a thing of him speaking about Roman and Greek culture and debating another person, Mary Palmer, or whatever her name was. But they were going back and forth, and everyone loved him. Everyone loved this hilarious person, this comedic figure. And it's weird to see that shift around. But when I say, and I've said this once, I'll probably say this 1,000 more times, the Illuminati, people think it's like fucking hooded cloaks and shit. And I'm like, I don't think that. I think media's Illuminati. I think all that's Illuminati. I think it's just the fact that you're going to make business by everything that sides in your view. And sadly, if you have enough power, which is control, which is if you get enough people to follow you, you got control. That's what the media is now. I don't think it's necessarily like inner workings or mysterious people. You don't know their names and faces, but we don't know the true person who owns CNN. We don't know all these. We see a face of a CEO or something, but we never see the owner, the guy who's making the big banks and shit like that. But we look at a concept of this. Like I could tell you right now, who's the CEO of Spotify? I follow him on Twitter, but I couldn't tell you his name, and I could barely tell you. I could tell you what he looks like. He's a bald guy with glasses, but I could tell you that. But nobody really knows who that is because they like the app. They're already in control of Spotify. They're already made by that. And then you see the CEOs and the people that do all the press release. What I look at is like that to me is Illuminati stuff, because you have so much power now where you can easily influx the flow of thought and control. And I don't necessarily think it's not the media's fault. From a business aspect, that's a profitable way to get shit done. But from more of a humanistic aspect, which I'm for, is the fact that now you're manipulating thought and you're interflowing. Like I tell people on the show, I'm not a scientist. I'm a podcaster. I'm 23 years old, but I'm not saying anything that's fact. I'm just saying from my own eyes, it's a conversation. It's an opinion piece. And I think that's what's important to clarify when you look at these places that call themselves entertainment or call themselves news. And when they get sued for something that they say, no, we're fall in the same category as WWE. I'm like, well, you don't fucking come off that way. And that's where I get really upset, because I see people that will spend their whole entire life inside of their home afraid of a certain political party or afraid of a certain thing and never live their life, which ruins those these years of experience buying into the garbage that ends up getting put into you. And I don't want to come off like some person who's like, oh, get a beef jerky basement or something like that. No, but I want people to understand the distinction of you have to have more critical thinking. And I think that's gone out the door with the fact that nobody can talk anymore. Nobody can agree to anything. Then what stops us all from eventually lining up and just being a part of a cult? And that's what's it's not really a cult of personality. It's a cult of fucking news reality.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that worries me, as I said, it is this tendency for us to stick with our tribe, um, and that the tribalism, I think, is the worry. Now, where that might become a cult is if is the punishment, if you like, for either leaving that tribe or saying something that is against the doctrines of the group. And there are some signs, I think, of that happening. So if you happen to be, left leaning, for instance, and you say something that isn't the way that some very vocal left wingers would think you should say, around some of the hot button issues at the moment, then yes, you get jumped on. Same goes for on the right as well, I think, of politics. And so what happens there then is you either just keep quiet about it. If you don't quite follow the party line on everything, you just keep quiet about those things you don't quite agree with until you come into line, because you're worried about the social impact if you do pop your head up above the parapet and say, well, actually, I'm not really sure about that, and that's that we're reducing the ability for people to be able to say that. So, if on Twitter, I want to give an example, but I don't want to go down a kind of rabbit hole of a particular subject. But if you had a view about trans issues, for instance, and again, I don't want to get drawn into this because it's an area that I'm still
You're
thinking
on your own
about.
lifeboat now.
Yeah. But that's a good example. So you might have a view about trans issues that is different to the group in which you feel most aligned, let's say. So in your little Twitter bubble, you've got your aligned group that people generally have the same attitudes to you about the various different aspects of social life and politics and so on. But maybe this one area you don't. And again, I'm not saying what my views are here, but in this one area, maybe you're different to the prevailing view within your little group. How you manage that, I think, is quite interesting. So if you are not able to say, well, actually, I've got some questions about this, for fear of being essentially shunned by your group, then yes, that sounds very much like a cult, because that's what it was like for me as a Jehovah's Witness who started to have doubts about the things I was taught. So, I started to think, well, actually, I think evolution makes a heck of a lot of sense. And if we had the ark, which we're supposed to believe the ark actually happened with all those different animals, if we've got all these, hundreds of thousands of different species, how did they get here after the ark? Well, either they put them all in the ruddy great ark, or they must have developed when they left the ark. This is if you believe there was an ark, but either way, it doesn't make sense. So these were questions I would ask. But it's very dangerous to do that if you're in a group like Jehovah's Witnesses, because then you get labeled as an apostate, spreading false lies and teaching against the teachings, and then you get put out the congregation. So my point is that feels quite a lot like some of the things that are happening. So in a way, I'm agreeing with you here that there are some risks that this tribalism creates this feeling that you can't actually ask a question because you're going to get jumped on. And that bothers me, because that is what damages critical thinking. If you can't say, well, I don't really understand this at the moment, I'm not actually sure where I stand on that, or even I actually take a slightly different view. If you can't say that within your group without being kicked out of the group, then yes, I think that starts to look a lot like a cult.
I think I agree with you, but I also get to a little bit of a side of where I stand is that I believe that everybody has has a right to an opinion on something or to be able to talk about a certain topic. When I get upset about it is like with trans issues, for instance, it's like, if you are on my side, then you can talk. But if you're not, I don't want to hear your opinion. You don't have any flow here. I'm like, you might have more invested into this than I do, because you're experiencing this, but doesn't mean I don't have the right to also talk about it as well too. Now, your decision is obviously, I don't give a fuck what people want to do. I don't give a shit. But at the same time, I still like to be able to talk about these topics when it comes to abortion, when it comes to any of these types of things, because I think that's how you get conversation. That's how you get a general discourse. I guarantee you, no people would give a shit if they said the Kellogg's people they're going to grind up all the striking protesters into giant frosted mini wheats. They'd give a shit because someone's going to die. But we don't have any opinion on that, basically, unless you can consume the product, sure. But you know who is more invested? The people that work for that company that are going through those conditions and want more time to see their families. Now, same thing with trans thing. If you want to go do the surgery or do whatever you want, or you want to be called whatever, sure, go ahead. I don't give a shit. But then it boils down to, when you start limiting someone's thought or saying someone's opinion isn't valid here, you start to have an issue where you start to go, then what are you're deeming someone unworthy of anything or even a type of thought. And that's when I start to get upset. I don't even own a gun and I have thoughts on gun stuff. But when people say, well, so you're pro gun, I don't give if they want to have a gun, sure. Do I think there needs to be a mental health check? A little bit. But at the same time, if somebody wants to own a gun and somebody wants to do whatever the hell they want with it, as long as it's not hurting anybody else and it's their property, I don't see the issue of stepping in there. And I think this boils down to a factor of, my major thing is here when it comes to the human mind and the psychology aspect of the damage that is getting done, that now people are I just bit my tongue. Talking too fast, but the issue that people are starting to, that's like 900 something episodes, is like the second time I think I've bitten my tongue. That was a soft bite.
It's amazing that we don't do that more often.
I know, right? But I mean, the brain, it's CNN. They've got me so mad. I'm biting my tongue, literally. But I think it's a concept of, when I start to get upset is when people say your thought and your opinion and your voice is not valid in a particular situation. And then when you start dismissing someone's voice or opinion or saying it's unworthy or pushing it out, is bad.
Don't get me wrong. I think it's perfectly acceptable to say, you don't know what you're talking about. You know, it's perfectly acceptable to say that, you know, so I don't think everybody's opinion is equally valid. I'll be honest. You know, if you're if I'm talking to an evolutionary scientist who studied that for the last 30
God created
years,
people, we all know.
Yeah, but if I'm talking to this evolutionary scientist who's been doing it for 30 years, I think this person knows more about it than some guy I might talk to in the pub. You know, so I think his or her view is more valid than this other person's. But I still think that other person has a right to have a view. Bingo. But I'm going to listen to this guy first, because he or she has studied for, you know, the last 30 years and been through all the hoops. Same goes for, you know, psychology or for all sorts of other sciences. I'm going to listen to, yes, the experts, because they studied it, not some guy on a, you know, all due respects to both of us, on a YouTube channel or a podcast, because they happen to have a platform to say it. I'm going to listen to the people who are the actual experts in this area. So, yeah, that doesn't mean that they're always going to be right, but I'm going to pay more heed to them. But I think it's okay that people can have different opinions. I also think it's all right to have an argument with somebody and say, look, I really don't agree with you on this issue. And you can argue quite violently without getting into actual physical violence. That's okay too. But where I think we do need to draw the line is literally shunning people and just basically putting people outside of our group because they don't happen to agree with everything that we agree with. And that's a cult.
What do you want to argue with me about? Let's do it.
Well, I think we do a pretty good job, don't we? We don't always agree with everything. When this is my third time on, I'm very honoured, by the way, to have been asked 3 times. It's great. I really wanted
to come back
coming on. But you know, we don't always agree with everything. I don't on everything. I don't think, but yeah, we leave, I think, thinking a bit more about the subject, and that's cool. I think you know, I'm happy to disagree about things, but ultimately, I I'm not going to stop talking to you.
I think that's what's important is you're supposed to have healthy discourse with people and you're
Yeah.
supposed to be communicative. But I mean, I I think there's a couple times I've had academics that hear a funny episode or a joking episode with a friend of mine and been like, can't do the show. Then I'll be blocked or something. I'm like, for that, really? You're not going to explain it to me, but whatever. That's their opinion. That's their thing to do. But I think there's just each conversation's different. Each one goes either really serious or more comedic. And then I think this kind of shows an aspect of like, it's not hard to talk to people. And sometimes you got to feel like you're along for the ride. And sometimes you got to put your foot down at times too. But I think a healthy discourse is kind of the point of everything because it exposes or gives a new perspective that you might not necessarily agree with, but it definitely makes you look at something a little bit differently, which I think is majorly important, I should say. And I think there's a lot of issues that we don't talk about that need to be talked about as well.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing that I wanted to say before when we were talking about opinions and so on is I think it's really important to start from the position that you don't know everything. I mean, that's one of the things I like about your show is, you want people to tell you stuff. And same goes for me. And the more I've studied, the less sure I am about a whole lot of things. And I think that's something that you see often. I started off thinking, I want to learn about psychology because I want to really understand how people tick and how it all works and everything. And now after 8 years of studying academia, I think I do know more than I did. Well, definitely know more than I did before, but I feel like I'm sure about a whole lot less. So I recognize where there's still debate, there's still disagreements within the field, there's still different opinions, because it's hard. So this is all hard stuff. The social world is difficult. Some of the decisions that we have to make about life and, you name it in the world, it's hard. How do we keep people safe from criminals, for instance? Do we have lots of police with guns, or do we create a different system where people police themselves a lot more? Do we put people away in prison? Do we have the death penalty for the most serious offences? These are all difficult questions. And whilst I might have some opinions about it, I'm not arrogant enough to think that I've got the last word. But it always amazes me on Twitter and in other places where people are so confident about their views. I think
they probably don't.
How did you get to be so confident?
They probably don't have that confidence in their everyday life. There's a lot of like screen, I would say, confidence when it comes to these types of things. And I'm like, would you be this aggressive towards someone if you were talking to them in person? Really? Like, there's a lot of like those Jay and Silent Bob moments where you just wish you had everybody's address to show up to their house and be like, did you say this on November? And then just rattle off the date. And it's a crazy time to be living in, obviously, with William Shatner going into space and all the other political stuff that falls in between. But you start landing on these lines of like, there used to be, and I think this is what I've been talking about, is that everyone wants someone to like a Burning Man, or somebody wants someone that they can put up on a torch and like, or string up like Jesus. And then people want the not stringing up, and they just want someone to save them from the mess. We're looking for a hero and we're looking for a bad guy as well, too. And I'm like, I think there's a lot of that, and necessarily people are just like, it's kind of like I talked to my not my Illuminati friend, my Freemasonry friend, who told me the Illuminati does exist, but more of like people that can just manipulate their work.
I was listening to that one. Yeah.
So when I was talking to him, I was like, I think everyone, so you heard my metaphor about just being high, where it's like you're noticing things that you necessarily probably would just not give a second glance to in your everyday life, which is like people are starting to look more obscure and trying to deep dive into things that might either find an issue or might create one. And I think that's kind of like being in a relationship too. Everyone's fine, everyone's happy, everyone's living together, and then someone says, you chew too loud, and then you notice it and you're like, fuck, I can't unhear it now. You start to see it's like you're creating a problem sometimes as well there too. Now, if there is one there, it should be fixed. But are we necessarily doing the proper methods of being able to do that? Defunding the police, for instance, when they did that, then there was people walking around with frying pans. Antifa was beating the shit out of people. In New York, there's people getting the shit beat out of them with baseball bats. And then they ramped up the police fund after that because
there's a great example of and I was going to say, I think the other thing that we need to grow up about as societies is that we always want simple answers. We want a simple phrase that sums up a simple answer. So, make America great again, defund the police. They all have this same simplistic framework to them, don't they? And actually, the answer is always complex and complicated. And that's not a popular view. So I'm never going to get elected to anything because I'd stand up there and say, okay, we've got difficulties with crime. It's actually a really complicated question, and the answer is going to be complicated. No, you're never going to get voted in if you say that. Yeah. Actually, what people want to hear is, I've got the answer, and it's really simple. Lock them up and throw away the key. Or the answer is always to rehabilitate. Now, actually, the reality is it's always going to be complicated. And the sooner as humanity we come to terms with the fact that, yeah, some things are simple, but a lot of things are actually quite complicated, and that we need to grow up and actually start to solve some of these complex problems.
Got my vote for president. I would just walk up and be like, Illuminati's real. I've seen it all. I got all the documents of it. And then I would take the risk of being shot in the head. I think it's important because there's a lot of stuff that it's necessary, like it goes under a different guise. I think I was talking about with David about this, was that about like the Black Lives Matter movement. There were some things in there that really didn't make a whole lot of sense, like defunding the police or tearing down infrastructure. And you realize the guy made a giant profit, like $3.5 million, and owns that's after all of his home buys too. And you start to realize, just because you say something that people agree with and a good notion, is it being taken the correct way? You know, I think we all agree that Black Lives Matter, but the tearing down of infrastructure and what they deem is, like, I've heard someone give me a new perspective saying, he was a psychologist on a Joe Rogan podcast, and it's on Fox News as well too. But he was talking about, like, you don't tear down the police, you increase the funding for it. Now, the anarchy side of me is like, I don't think that's how we get Australia. But then he brought in a good perspective. He goes, well, it holds more people accountable if you have more people in this situation. Then when you see something bad happening, when it's usually one-on-one cop videos you see, when it's like one cop or two cops doing something that they shouldn't be doing, you start to have more accountability towards it. It's much like when the cops were now able to be sued. If something happens to them, it's going to be their fault. The state doesn't help you out in this situation, so there's not a repeat of another George Floyd incident or anything like that. You're now held liable. But then the cost to that, like we talked about before, like these transactions that happen that are kind of unwritten agreements, is that these cops, they show up and they 5 mile an hour it all the way to the emergency call, thinking, I'll just clean up whatever's left. That's the issue, is that there needs to be proper fixes and proper looks through these things. You can't just be like, it needs to be gone or it needs to be ramped up 100%. No, you need to thoroughly go in it and invest the time into fixing a problem that's not going to end up bubbling up later. It's going to be fixed and done right.
And the thing is, we sometimes do know the answers to these questions. So in the UK, we have a real problem at the moment with what we call social care. So as you may or may not know, we have a national health service. So we all we pay in what we call national insurance, and that is essentially we can all get free medical care at the point of need. But that doesn't cover long-term illness as you get older often, but actually not only when you get older. So it doesn't cover like things like being looked after at home, having visits to make sure you're okay, and perhaps changing medicine, or basically some people obviously need help going to the toilets and all of that sort of thing. That's all social care, and that isn't covered by the National Health Service. So we have a real problem with that at the moment, because we don't know how to fund it. We don't know how to kind of slip that into the existing NHS system. Well, I say we don't know. Actually, we probably do know, because there have been lots and lots of reports done on it. Same goes for things like mental health services and so on. We've got a lot of data, we've got a lot of analysis, but the difficulty is again, politician saying to people, in order for us to fund this, we're going to have to charge you X amount of on your tax bill. You know, nobody's going to vote for a party that's going to say, I promise you, I'm going to put your taxes up, you know. So therefore it doesn't happen. And we still limp on year after year after year with the same problem. Same issue, you know, different system, I guess, but you have some similar issues in the States with healthcare and the fact that, you know, you have mainly a private healthcare system. What about those people that can't pay for that private healthcare system? What about people that have existing conditions that can't get insurance because these organizations have essentially a monopoly on, you know, on these services? These are complicated issues, and it needs somebody saying, right, whichever model we use, there's always going to be some issues that we need to deal with, rather than it just being, you know, the National Health Service is communism and, you know, the end of the world, and there's never a place for private healthcare. You know, I think either extreme isn't actually interested in looking for a solution. That's more about the ideology behind it.
What's the lesser of two evils?
Well, defunding the police is another one. I mean, it actually came across, like a lot of things do, came across the pond, and you know, it's one of those things that did get talked about in the UK. And I mean, what does that actually mean? If you're talking about funneling some of the money from some areas of policing to perhaps dealing with mental health crises that the police often end up having to deal with. I mean, I've heard some amazing statistics about how many calls, both in the UK and in the US, the police are having to deal with mental health problems more than pretty much anything else, as far as I understand it.
To deal with those.
That's not. Well, why are we expecting these people to do that job?
Well, it's the opposite way too. They tried to get therapists or mental health counselors to deal with police scenarios, and it's like, you can't do that either.
Yeah, so I mean, if you're saying, well, let's invest in some of this area,
Starsky and Hutch it. That's all you got to do.
You know, the point is, we don't have the answers, you and me. We're podcasters, but do we as humanity have the answers? Well, possibly, but we've got to grow up and actually have these adult conversations. And yeah, I'm not sure we're quite there yet. Maybe we need to do more of this.
I don't know. Maybe we should just ground people up like frosted shredded mini wheats. No, we got to leave it. We got to end on something positive. But I think it's what I really appreciate about talking to you about these things too, is that you can kind of like hear me out in a way, and then also give me some insight on some things too. But I mean, I think it's a general positive discourse when it does come across, and I appreciate you for doing my podcast again, even though I know each time I'm like, you're probably like, Jesus Christ. But I really do appreciate you having you back on again. Where can people find you, Stephen?
Yeah, so our little podcast is called "What Should I Think About?" question mark. So it's called "What Should I Think About?" because when you're in a cult, you don't have to worry about what you believe, because you're told what to believe and you're told what to think about everything. So when you leave after 20, 30, 40 years, you're then faced with all these questions. What should I think about this? What should I think about politics? What should I think about religion? What should I think about God? And all the little things in between as well. So you're faced with all these questions about what you're going to do in life. And so that's kind of where it comes from. Me and my daughter Celine, we talk about a whole bunch of different subjects every week. On a Wednesday, we talk to each other. On a Sunday, we have a guest and we interview somebody, either somebody who's just come out of a group or been out of a group for some years, or maybe they're an expert in cult recovery or a researcher into cults. So yeah, check us out. We're on all the good podcast apps and a lot of the bad ones as well. So yeah, it'd be great to get more listeners. So yeah, come and join us.
I swear to God, if your daughter comes on my show, I will be as professional as hell. I won't be as crazy as you've been on because your first time I did a good job, but then the second time after that, I was like, he's dipped his toes in Robbie. We got to just fucking go down the rabbit hole now.
Well, I know what to expect now, so it's cool. No, I think it's different to our podcast, but then they all are different, aren't they? So yeah, that's cool. It's ours isn't scripted either. We don't have a script. I might have a few questions maybe that I'll ask my guest, but then it just goes in whatever direction the guest wants to take it, really. But I think it's probably a bit more structured than yours. That doesn't make it better than yours. It's just different. We do have a kind of subject we want to talk about, and we do talk about that. Whereas I think with you like this to be a kind of free form, see where it goes, which is great fun. I love it.
All right, so it's a full scripted show, but you couldn't tell.